Thank you very much, everyone, for coming for our second Explore Research Rounds session for 2019-2020. I'm Brynn Robinson. I'm the Research Engagement Manager here at Horizon Health, the research services. And before we get started with our presenter today, just wanted to talk about what the sessions are. You know, we started this last year, and we want to engage with the research community and present on topics that are of relevance to starting and analyzing research studies and knowledge translation and patient engagement, things that we were coming into contact with through our consultations here at Research Services at Horizon. So it's for staff around the room here, you can see, and online. We also have other individuals coming in to join us, like our guest speaker today from University of New Brunswick, and we, like I said, different topics relating to research from September to May, and we are here in person at the regional hospital and online at Skype. If you want to join future sessions, we have an Eventbrite, and if you look for Horizon Research Services, you can find the rest of the sessions for the year. Last month I presented on logic models, and today we're so pleased to have Julia Woodhall-Melnik from UNB, who's going to talk about working with at-risk and vulnerable populations. And as you can see, over the next couple months, we have a wide range of topics that you can take part in. So definitely get in touch with us, research services at horizonnb.ca, if you have any questions about an upcoming session, or if you want to suggest a topic for a future session for next year. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the reins to Julia, and she's going to present on research considerations for working with vulnerable and at-risk populations.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for having me today. I think I'll probably just sit and chat because it's a pretty informal talk that I'm going to give today. So yeah, thanks for having me. The topics look really interesting. I would have come to logic models last month if I knew. I'm terrible with following Eventbrite and a whole bunch of that kind of stuff, so there you go. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about research with vulnerable populations. There's a few things that I will say, but there's a lot of questions to consider as well too. So I'm just going to start in terms of telling you a little bit about myself, so you know what position I come from in terms of studying vulnerable populations. So this is my lab actually at UNB. Great group of people, great group of students. I am a sociologist by training. I'm what we call like a medical or health sociologist. And after finishing my degree in sociology, my PhD, I actually worked for the first 2 years of my postdoctoral career at a hospital. So I was at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto with their Center for Research on Inner City Health. It's now the Center for Urban Health Solutions. I don't know why they changed the name, but they did. So at that center, we were actually focused on studying vulnerabilities, multiple vulnerabilities in different populations. And part of the work that we did was to bring together physicians and members of the research community, and also to promote research within the physician community. So currently the director of the institute, Stephen Wong, is actually a clinician. Like, he still holds clinic hours at the hospital. So it was a great opportunity to learn about how epidemiological and social research takes place in a hospital setting, and to learn from some of the social epidemiologists who were very concerned with studying vulnerable populations. From there, I moved to a CIHR postdoc, which I held at McMaster University. So I did that for probably about 2.5 years until I came here. So I've been here for just over a year, and I've kind of hit the ground running. So I'm always doing things, but I'm very busy. But yes, I moved here with my 2 little boys, and it's a good place to be, I think. So my lab, the Lab for Housing and Mental Health, we launched that this summer. And specifically what we've been working on is climate change and flooding, how that contributes to mental health. We're starting to look a little bit more at eco-anxiety, because that's something that we're seeing as a big concern. So we know that the Lancet's Commission on Climate Change has said that climate change is going to be one of the biggest factors in influencing public health in the next century. So we're trying to look at the vulnerabilities that people would experience, whether it be economic or social vulnerabilities, and how they impact experiences of climate change. And then we have a large study right now that focuses on movement into rent geared to income or social housing and how that impacts mental health of people who receive access to affordable housing. Because we think it would increase mental health, but actually, believe it or not, we don't really know. So that's something that we're working on right now. NBHRF has been really nice in funding it, and we're waiting to, fingers crossed for CIHR. Hopefully you can all cross your fingers and your toes for me in this room. Extra goodwill, right? There you go. All right. So that's pretty much me. Just an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Some of the ethical considerations of doing research with vulnerable populations, some practical considerations, because there are some practical things, and some of the methods that I've used in studies that are not your typical survey methods or interview methods that help to engage individuals who experience vulnerability. So one of the studies I will draw a lot on today, I did a study, it was a mixed method study of men who experienced long-term homelessness in Hamilton, Ontario. So this study was specifically to evaluate the impacts of a Housing First program on their lives. So men were offered access to housing with intensive case management, and I spent a year engaging in that case management office and did some interviews and did some quantitative tracking as well too. So a lot of and this was actually through my postdoc at McMaster, it was probably one of the more seminal experiences in my life. I was at the time when I walked into that early postdoc, I was 27, newly married, this white middle class girl who just had no clue. I thought, I experienced housing precariousness during my degree, right? But a lot of students do. I thought, okay, I come from a working class background. It's not exactly like I'm privileged. I really had no clue. So spending the year engaging with case managers who engaged with the population directly really helped me understand how I could be around a population and, what my role was, and just how to figure out how to do things respectfully, right? Because you're not always, as much as we all have the best intentions, just because we have great intentions doesn't mean that we really understand how to engage appropriately. Okay. So I will draw on that experience a lot because I learned a lot of great little tricks from spending time with people who knew the community so well. Okay, so my first question is, when Bryn asked me to come in today, I was like, okay, I could talk about this, but what is vulnerability, right? And not to be too hung up on words, because I know that's the academic in me, but I know lately we don't like the word marginalized because we're thinking about pushing people to the margins. It's not a nice thing to say, right? So I look at vulnerability, and I was when I was preparing this last night, while I was teaching a class at the same time, maybe, no, but on my class break. So when we think about vulnerability, really, it can apply to so many different groups of people, right? So I have experience in homelessness research, but I don't have a lot of experience researching kids with developmental delays, right? So this lens that I bring you today, I think it's important to note that, I do have experience with certain populations, but when you're going out to do research with vulnerable populations, you really need to talk to the people who know the people who you want to study, right? So vulnerability, technically, I did a whole bunch of searching in my few minutes last night of my prepping, and the best definition I could actually come up with was dictionary.com. There wasn't a lot out there that actually defines vulnerability. I looked at the World Health Organization, I looked at CIHR, and no definitions of vulnerability. So basically, I got the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. That could be anyone. So this involves any form of power imbalance based on any form of characteristic, right? So I was actually sitting around. I have a very, very intelligent little 4-year-old who wants to take on the world and climate change and all this great stuff. And this morning I was explaining to my husband that I was coming here. And my son said, well, what is vulnerability? And I said, well, it's, people who are at risk of being harmed, right? Because there's some form of power imbalance there. And I looked around the table and I said, myself as a myself as a woman, I could be seen as vulnerable, right? In certain situations to gender-related violence, right? And I said, you and your brother as children could be seen as vulnerable because you're young, right? It's age-related vulnerability. And then I looked at my husband and I said, you're a cis white male that's like upper middle class. You're fine. So, I mean, it was at a point where, and then he's like, yeah, there you go, right? So basically, just to highlight that there are so many different things that go into vulnerability. And I could be vulnerable in one situation and not in another, right? So I could be vulnerable to discrimination in research based on gender. But I'm not vulnerable when I teach my students, right? They're vulnerable in that situation because I have the power, right? So it's really taking a look at what vulnerability is and how you're defining vulnerability before you do your work and checking in with the community that you're actually doing work with. I think that's so important to find the experts in your field and not just the academic experts, right? The experts that probably some of you are and some of the experts you work with every day, right? So your social workers, people who can connect you with the actual community on the ground. Okay. So a few ethical considerations that I want to bring up. I'm going to keep it fairly quick. I want to do I want to hear a lot of questions from you guys. So a few questions I think that are important to ask yourself before you start research with any vulnerable group is basically, why do I want to know this? Is there a good reason for you knowing something? Sometimes we want to know things just because we're curious, right? And that's awesome. Like, I'm a curious person. I've raised curious children. Curiosity is an amazing quality. But does it warrant asking somebody to talk about their trauma with you? Does it warrant collecting intimate details about somebody? Curiosity? Maybe not, right? You have to think about who it will benefit. So if you're doing a research study to put you on the map as a cutting edge researcher, awesome, cool, but the population needs to have some benefit as well too, right? So what are they getting out of it? Are you going to make it easier for clinicians or social workers to serve a population, right? Are you going to be doing some form of improvement, it really is like, feels like Friday, improvement along the line, right? Another thing to ask yourself, do I need to collect primary data, right? So before I left Hamilton, I was actually asked to go speak to a graduate seminar of individuals who were doing a study on the experiences of men who were enrolled in a Housing First program in Hamilton. A different Housing First program than I studied. It's one that popped up after the one that I did. And they were asking a lot of similar life history questions as myself. And I went in and I said to them, well, I have data on this that's published that you can draw on to do some form of a secondary literature review, right? We shouldn't be collecting data if somebody has already collected data. Again, because we're putting people, well, I mean, we're wasting our own time and resources, but we're also putting people in positions where they're forced to disclose information that we maybe didn't need to ask them about, right? So some of these men that this graduate seminar were interviewing had also been interviewed by myself. So now not only were they asked by me a year prior to disclose their family histories of trauma, so one of the first questions I asked was, before you were 13, where were you living? And what was that like, right? They're now being asked similar things to recant past abuses to this group of graduate students. So really, was there any value in that? There could have been, but could have the grad students found something different to do to get that information? There's a ton of secondary data out there with NBI-RDT. We're going to have access to a whole bunch of information from a ton of people. Sometimes there's easier ways and better ways to get your data. Has this been overstudied? Same type thing, right? Am I the right person to study this, right? That's a good question to ask yourself as well, too. Can you connect with the population, right? Do you have the training that you need to have in order to engage with the population? Do you have lived experience with something so you can understand? And if you don't have lived experience, like I didn't as this like 27-year-old clueless girl, can you find a way to go out and learn from others' experiences before you interact with the population, like hanging out in a case management office for a year? I remember seeing somebody, there was a A&W down the street, like 2 doors down from the case management office, and I saw a woman who I knew was a client at the day use center there steal a bottle of vinegar. And I thought to myself, why would anybody steal a bottle of vinegar? Like, that seems like the strangest thing to steal. So naive. And I went into the case management office and I'm like, why did she do that? Obviously, I didn't tell the people at the NW because that's not my place, and fly on the wall, right? And the case manager was like, she stole it so she can mix her drugs. I'm like, oh, right? Like, the things that you don't know, it's almost more important to acknowledge the things that you don't know going into these situations and learn them before you engage with populations. And that goes straight to, will my presence as a researcher create more harm, right? Should we, again, be asking people to recount stories of pain? Another thing, am I the right person to study this? What if somebody is upset by something that you say? How can you react to that, right? We as researchers, depending on what role you have as a researcher, but myself as a researcher, I'm not clinical, right? Beyond mental health first aid training, I can't respond to somebody in crisis, right? So at what point do I draw the line? And how do I put checks and balances in place to make sure that I can protect people if they are harmed by the research I do? Okay, so big question, should I really be doing this? I guess is the question that you need to ask yourself. And the idea behind this is to be honest, right? Okay, practical considerations, a whole different ballgame. Okay, so how are you going to access a population? This is, for clinical people, this can be somewhat easier if you have a patient base, right? And if you've looked at some of your ethical considerations and you've connected with people who have knowledge about a population, usually that can help. So we call them gatekeepers in research, right? People who can help you gain access to a population. How do you gain vulnerable people's trust and encourage honesty is another big thing, right? So there was, when I was doing the research study with men who experienced homelessness, there's a lot of distance between them and people that they consider to be like professional experts, right? So if I were to have come in just and started the interviews right at the beginning of that year when I was in the case management office, they probably would have told me where to go. And granted, like, I'm just some person coming over from Mac with these big long consent forms and all of that great stuff. And why should they trust me, right? So really it was closer to the end of the year after they had seen me at their day use center for the entire year that I did the interviews. And at that point I was, there was a few of the men there that would be like, hey doc, what's up, right? So we had a relationship formed, but that took time of actually genuinely wanting to get to know people. I would my coffee break every day was in the day use center, and I drank their coffee. It was also free, and I was a postdoc. So not saying I experienced economic marginalization, but postdocs aren't paid like great salaries, right? So free coffee every day in the day use center. And while I was sitting there, I got to chat with people, right? Because you're going into their environment and you're essentially one of them at that point, right? You're using the service as well too. I actually, when I did the interviews and the recruitment, I got one of my friends, I was allowed to hire a research assistant, and he was doing his PhD with me when I was in school. He was still there. And he is this 50-year-old man that has a habit of growing these really long beards, and really, like, he's a rough Okanagan guy who was almost homeless in the Okanagan at one point in his life. And I brought him in to do the interviews and do the recruitment, and he was phenomenal with these men because he could really relate to them. So again, if you don't have that experience, you might want to find somebody who can come with you to bring some of that experience. And the men loved him. He went into a hot meal program where we were doing some recruitment. And I turn around and I'm like, where did Svensson go? Where is he? And he's sitting down with the guys eating food. He's got a meal tray and he was having a great time. So it was good. Can we keep people engaged in a study if it's longitudinal, right? So how are you going to make sure that you follow up with people? When people are vulnerable, they're also vulnerable to being lost in research, right? So different tricks that we've used, we've asked people to, in their original recruitment, when they do their first interview, we've asked them to leave various forms of contact, so email, phone number, address, if there is an address, and then we'll ask them to leave a phone number of somebody who they see frequently. So whether it be a caseworker or a relative or something like that, so we can get a hold of them through them if we need to. Obviously, there's ethical stuff that you have to deal with around that too, right? So there you go. It's all a nice can of worms. Other thing, should you compensate them for their time, right? That's a big thing that we deal with at UNB. I was told by the Research Ethics Board, I always like to give $25 per hour because I'm like, that's a living wage. Usually in the form of some form of gift card, which I found out we can't do at UNB. So $25 cash, I guess. And it's a way to, it's weird, it's like our finance office rule or something. But as a way to recognize them for their time while giving them something that would be considered more of a living wage. I've actually been told in recent research with homeless youth that I can't do that. That I have to give them minimum wage only because I could be deterring them from going to their job, which could put them at risk. And then I think, oh, so you have to balance some of these considerations you have in your mind too of, okay, I understand I don't want to put them at risk of losing their employment, but at the same time, I want to value them for what they're worth, right? So when you're dealing with ethics boards, how much do you give out of your own values and ethics in order to meet what needs to be done to do the research under the guidance of an REB, right? How will we contact one another? This is an interesting one. So you have to sometimes wonder, when you're working with vulnerable populations, and they get to the point where they've disclosed their lives to you and they feel like they can trust you, you need to protect them from trying to reach out to you as a social worker or clinician or therapist or whatever it may be, right? Because you're not up for that job, right, necessarily. I know I'm not. So when I worked with the men in Hamilton, I actually had a burner phone, which was really funny because I walked around and I was like, look at me with my cool burner phone. I could be a drug dealer. And no. Yeah, there you go. But I had my nice little burner phone. And people contacted me there. And to me, it wasn't enough to just say this is my office line because I was only in my office for a number of hours a day. I wanted to make sure that when somebody picked up the phone to book an interview with me, I could call them. The other thing, too, is when you're really vulnerable and you're experiencing crisis, the last thing that you are going to remember necessarily is to attend your research interview, right? So we wanted to be able to send out lots of reminders, and texts were a great way to do that, right? So just a text saying like, hey Joe, you still meeting me at 1 o'clock today, right? Are there any safety concerns for them, right? Where are you doing your research? We did some of our research in a place that was notorious for bed bugs, right? So how did we protect them from that? How do you protect yourself from that, right? Like $3,000 to spray for bed bugs in your house. Yeah. So you have to worry about those types of things as well too. Are you bringing them to an area if they're in recovery that's putting them at risk, right? So I decide that I want to do interviews in Waterloo Village because that's accessible, and I think that it's accessible to the population. Well, if I'm interviewing somebody who's in recovery, do they want to run into, somebody who used to sell them drugs? Probably not. That could be triggering, right? So we need to think about all of these different aspects before we go out to do our interviews. Last thing, any barriers, things like language, again, things like mental health, right, that we need to consider. A big barrier in the research I did with the men was our research ethics board at McMaster was concerned about capacity for consent. So whether or not we know that there's a lot of traumatic brain injury in long-term homeless individuals. And they were very concerned about capacity. So they actually had me do what they called a teach back exercise. Before you write that down, it's not as nice as you think it is. So I did it. But essentially, I had to read them the consent form and then ask them 3 questions about the study. So in your own words, can you tell me what this study is about? Do you have to participate in this study? And then do you agree to participate in this study? So essentially it was that you were checking to see that they knew it was voluntary and that they knew what you were doing in the study. Awesome, but if you have somebody who is fully capable, that is super demeaning and super patronizing. So I ended up finding this way of playing it up as like, my stupid employer made me do this, and like making it seem like the man required this, which they kind of did. But it really was an awful experience, like for the men and for myself, right? So assuming that just because somebody is a member of a vulnerable population that they can't consent, there's negatives associated with that as well too. But we do need to make sure that all of those boxes are ticked. So depressing. It's sad. Okay, so just before I go into some of the solutions or some of the methods that I've used for this type of stuff, I just wanted to talk about reflexivity as a concept. So we use this concept a lot in sociology, the idea of reflexivity. And it's basically, to summarize it in a very non-scientific way, it's basically checking yourself, right? Trying to understand what your social positions are and how they contribute to what you do as a researcher, right? So me saying that I was, this young girl who was raised in, middle class, white, never experienced homelessness, it might seem like a silly thing to you that I would say that, but it's actually really important that I identify that, I'm not part of this population. I don't have these experiences. I am privileged. I know I'm privileged, and I need to make sure that I check that lens when I'm doing my research. Part of being reflexive as well too is not just understanding your own position, but understanding your actions and monitoring them. Okay? So after every interview, sitting down and reflecting, was there something that I said during that interview that maybe I shouldn't have? Right? When you're interacting with the community, should I have approached them that way? Did I do something wrong here? Is there something that I did that made somebody feel really comfortable? How can I do that again? Right? So basically being able to take responsibility for things that we don't think went so well and recognizing the things that did go well and using those again in our research. So really it is the basic idea of just checking yourself, right? And making sure that if you are doing harm, you're recognizing that that harm exists, and that you try to do something to correct it. Okay, so last thing, I just wanted to, before we do questions, because I want to do lots of questions, I just wanted to leave you with a unique method that we used at St. Mike's to do gambling studies. So it was research with men who had histories of problem gambling and histories of homelessness. So what we did is we actually hired peer interviewers. So we hired individuals who were in recovery from various addictions, who had previous experiences of homelessness, and we fully engaged them as members of our research team. So these were individuals, they were in recovery. We actually found them through social services programs at local colleges. And we gave them a ton of training. We engaged them straight from the beginning. So in terms of writing the interview guides, looking through our interview guides to work on language, different ideas. They became the interviewers. So we did a few training interviews. And these individuals went out and they interviewed their peers. Now, there was a lot of training that went into when to disclose your own personal information. Only do it if you're comfortable. Harm protection for themselves. So we did a lot of check-ins on, is this triggering you, right? Like, is it okay that you're talking to somebody about getting blackout drunk, right? Is that something that's going to impact your own recovery? So that was something that we were able to do. It was fairly actually extensive. So the idea really came from Eliot and Watson. So this is a great read for like early ideas of surrounding more of like the theories of using peer interviewers and how we can use peers to get more rich data and to make people feel comfortable. The article that we published in Qualitative Research is very much a practical how-to. So if you're looking to do peer interviewing, the article itself goes over a lot of like the considerations that you would have to think about. So one of the reasons why it did work is because we were doing it at St. Michael's Hospital, where they had amazing human resources structures, right? The study was well funded. It took a lot of money to train people, right? It took a lot to get it through ethics too, which meant that we needed a very diligent research coordinator, right? So very much there were so many considerations. And we actually had the peer interviewers do safety check-ins and wellness check-ins after every interview. They participated in journaling, so reflexivity journaling, that basically they recounted their experiences as interviews after each interview. We were going to publish it with them, and then we still haven't gotten around to it, which I think the data are aging out at this point, like they're hitting past that 5-year window, so I don't know if we ever will. But yeah, so it's an interesting thing to think about. There are some awesome, really unique methods out there now that we're not just sticking with the standard interview. Photo voice is a great one. So giving people cameras and having them document experiences for you and then talking about it. One of my master's students is using guided photo voice to learn about housing and its contributions to social inclusion in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So she's actually using a more guided technique where she's going to walk along with individuals. But the idea is, instead of going to ask care workers about how people with disabilities feel, she actually wants to hear their experiences, right? Which I think is important. So using something like photographs as a medium for discussing those experiences is something that can be really useful. So I guess my takeaway from that is, if you're wondering how to engage people and you're not strictly regulated to, I mean, I do really big quantitative studies too, I mix methods, so I love both worlds. But if you're doing something more exploratory and you're not strictly regulated to a quantitative design, you might want to look outside of the box and see what methods are out there for engaging people in a more compassionate way. So, questions?